Okay, so good day to everybody over here. We are the undergrads here today are discussing freedom of speech and expression with emphasis on the part of the media. Joining us today is Mr. Varun Kannan. Mr. Varun Kannan is an alumni of one of the most prestigious law schools in India, which is WBNUJS, which is based in Kolkata. He graduated in May and is scheduled to start working with Cyril Amarchand Mangaldas coming this January. Mr. Varun Kannan has great interest and keen interest in, especially in subjects such as constitutional law, commercial law, as well as public policy. Thank you so much, Mr. Kannan, for joining us here today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So just to give a little context to our discussion today, I would like to talk about how freedom of speech and freedom of media is imperative in India, in independent India today, especially after it was denied by the British. However, even subsequently after freedom, we saw that receiving this information became a very difficult task, not because the government stopped it, but it was the accessibility of such information. When we go back in time, we see only 2 or 3 news channels that existed back then, mainly Doordarshan. And this basically was the source of all information for all information to people, and there was no choice of information. However, subsequently, we now have 892 TV channels in India. A substantial number of this are news channels. And with this, we see that there is a blast of information to the public. And this is both a boon as well as a bane. Why is it a boon? People have a choice to make over here now. They can choose what they want to watch. They can choose how to shape their ideologies. And they can go up and they can make a choice as to what they want to watch and what they don't want to watch. Why is it a bane? Now we see that media houses are pitted against one another. This basically makes them compete, which makes them indulge in activities such as making news controversial or flashy. And only the most controversial or flashy news channels are the ones who succeed. And with this, I would like to ask Yash, what is the current context or what is the current status quo with respect to the media houses today?
Right. Thanks. So friends, in recent days, we have observed 2 very important cases that has been discussed in public domain related to Article 19, that is freedom of speech and expression. Now, in the very first case, one of the leading lawyers of the Supreme Court published a few comments on Twitter casting aspersions against former CGIs of the Supreme Court. In the second case, a TRP scam was unearthed by the regulator, that is PARC itself, followed by a police complaint registered by Hansa Research, the vendor of the park. Now, one of the leading media houses has also published the Hansa report in public domain by receiving the same from its sources. We understand that the FIR lodged by the Hansa report is a criminal case, and the police have every right to investigate the same. However, we have observed that the ample stress that has been given on the media house to disclose its sources by putting all the might of the police force. Now, it has been already an established fact that media has the liberty to put forth the information received from its credible sources, and they are not supposed to disclose the same. Although the manner in which the things are going at present, it appears that as if it is the return of the emergency, where the government of the day does not allow to air the dissenting voice, which in somehow is a process to curb the media freedom. Now, for a vibrant democracy like ours, I strongly believe that media, which is also considered as the 4th pillar of our democracy, must be allowed to express its views without fear or intimidation. And to discuss the constitutionality and the history of freedom of speech in independent India, I'm very pleased that Mr. Varun has joined us today. So let's not wait too much. Let's start the session. Once again, Mr. Varun, most welcome to our channel, and we really thank you for giving your precious time to us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Okay.
So Varun, we can start.
Yeah, sure, Varun.
Yeah.
Varun, my first question to you would be in light of a statement made by Fali S. Nariman. He once said that we all have freedom of speech, but what we may or may not have is freedom after speech. So with respect to this statement, what is your opinion on freedom of speech in the Indian context?
Yeah. So I think just to take forward what both of you all said in your introduction. So one aspect that we often ignore, especially nowadays, is that along with the state restricting freedom of speech, there are a lot of times when private parties are the ones who are restricting freedom of speech. So I'll give you like a couple of examples of the recent past itself. So last month, in fact, in September, there was this issue where a book published by Bloomsbury, which was regarding the Delhi riots, which took place in the beginning of this year, was actually withdrawn by the publisher because there was a lot of outrage on social media platforms. So this is one instance. I'll just give you a couple of more and then we can analyze it together. The next instance is something that we actually witnessed a couple of weeks back itself. This brand named Tanishq had this particular advertisement regarding the jewelry that they wanted to sell and which portrayed Hindu-Muslim communal harmony in a very nice way. In my view, that was a very good portrayal of Hindu-Muslim unity in light of all the problems that we've had in the recent past. So that ad also had to be withdrawn under pressure. In fact, in Gujarat, a Tanishq store was also attacked because by some elements. So this is the second instance. And the third instance, if you see, it happened just a couple of days back. So there's this very famous cricketer called Muttiah Muralitharan, and he's in fact the highest wicket taker in Test cricket. And there was this biopic of his which was going to be made. In fact, it's still under production. And there's this Tamil actor named Vijay Sethupathi who was supposed to play the lead role in that. Now, Muttiah Muralitharan has had certain strong views regarding the Tamil community in Sri Lanka, and which is why there was a lot of opposition in the state of Tamil Nadu regarding a Tamil actor taking that role. And because of the public pressure, even he had to withdraw. So when you talk about freedom after speech, this is something which is very important for us to know, that in all these three instances that I just pointed out, it was in fact private players who were trying to restrict our freedom of speech in some particular way. And when we talk about private players, many times, I'm sure even you guys would have noticed this on social media platforms itself, is that someone's stance on freedom of speech is very much linked to what their ideology is. Now, for example, if someone is writing a book, I may agree with that book, I may disagree with that book. But that is my choice whether I want to read that book or not. No one is compelling me to read that book. So I technically do not have the right to say without having read the book. In fact, the book was not even released when the social media campaign started. Now, without having read the book, how can I arrive at a conclusion regarding the book? Now, that is what is problematic in the first place, because my conclusion is based on certain ideological predilections that I may have. And even the same thing with the Tanishq ad also. Now, if you look at the Tanishq ad from a neutral perspective, you wouldn't find any problem with it because ultimately it was in furtherance of secularism, which is part of our constitution. But if you look at it with a certain ideological lens, that is when that ad becomes problematic to certain elements of society. So either way, irrespective of what our ideological position is, our stance in free speech cannot vary based on that. Now, for example, our stance in free speech doesn't vary based on where we sit. It has to be consistent either way. And this is one major problem that I've noticed on social media, because when we talk about freedom after speech, nowadays we have to take into account the fact that on social media itself, people are pressurized to withdraw something that they've said, to actually not publish a movie or publish a book, etc. So social media plays a very important role nowadays in actually ensuring that we don't have freedom after something that we say. And in fact, a lot of us also, we do this on a daily basis, we may not realize. But many times what we say and what we write, what we tweet on Twitter, etc., we often take into account what the public reaction to that will be. So in a way, we are self-censoring ourselves because we are in a way a bit worried about the consequences, because we know that certain things that we may say may not be well taken by certain sections of society. And that, I think, is an equally important problem that we face nowadays. Like, the state obviously has a very important role to play in terms of regulating free speech, but nowadays it's private actors, and especially the social media companies like Facebook, Twitter, etc., which actually in a way play a part in restricting our freedom to say something, and after saying something, how people may react to it. So I think, yeah, this is very important for us. When we talk about free speech in the Indian context, we should also keep into account how private parties are actually influencing and to a certain extent also manipulating what we say.
Right. So far we have somehow discovered a status quo. We have established a status quo, I would say. Now, I think it's very imperative for us to understand the history of Article 19, and especially with respect to the introduction of the First Amendment, where freedom of speech and expression moved from an absolute right to one bound by reasonable restriction. And juxtaposing this development in contemporary times with people having access to unrestricted amount of information, this could actually come to you as a tongue twister. But what is the reasonability of reasonable restriction today?
Okay. So yeah, just to give some context to those who are listening to us. So when Article 19 was first passed as part of the original constitution in 1950, the term reasonable restriction was not present in Article 19(1)(a), 19(2), sorry. The Article 19.2 only said restriction on so and so grounds. Now, this entire adding of the word reasonable, in fact, took place via the First Amendment in 1951. And along with adding the term reasonable, the First Amendment also added two other very important restrictions to Article 19.2. And these are the two restrictions that we see come into play on a daily basis. One of them is the public order restriction, which is one part of 19.2, even as of today. And the second is in the interest of the security of the state. Now, we often forget that even the interest of the security of the state, which is one of the main restrictions which justify our sedition laws, etc., was also added in 1951. So when legendary lawyers such as B.R. Ambedkar drafted the original constitution, they did not even envisage that public order and security of the state will have to be put in. This was something that was subsequently discovered by Prime Minister Nehru, etc. And it's important to note that in 1951, when the First Amendment was passed, while Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister, the Law Minister was in fact Mr. B.R. Ambedkar himself, who was a pioneer of our constitution, and our constitution was barely passed 1 year before the First Amendment was actually introduced in Parliament. Now, the First Amendment is very important because that is what has actually given subsequent governments the power to restrict freedom of speech and expression using very wide grounds. And even when the First Amendment was being debated in Parliament after Jawaharlal Nehru and Ambedkar introduced it, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee had in fact said on the floor of Parliament that we are giving tools which future generations and future governments can misuse. And he had in fact warned Pandit Nehru that, listen, you may not be in power on a permanent basis. And tomorrow, another government is very well capable of misusing the powers that you're giving them. Because one of Nehru's and Ambedkar's justification was we need to give wider restrictions on freedom of speech and expression for future generations. So that if there is some anti-India activity, etc., or is there there's some threat to the security of the state, the government has proper redressal mechanisms under the law. So this is something which is very important for us to keep in mind, that the First Amendment is actually what, in a way, gave the government the powers to restrict freedom of speech and expression. And in the floor of Parliament, those like Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, who actually had great foresight to warn future generations that, look, giving a power is fine, is one thing, but the fact is the power that you're giving will definitely be misused by the future governments, etc. Because every government ultimately wants to restrict freedom of speech and expression, because governments are worried about the kind of narrative that will be given about them on social media platforms. And even before social media platforms came, even the print media has always had a very influential role to play, especially even during the emergency. It was the print media which first was attacked by Indira Gandhi before she attacked other forms of communication. So this is something which is very important for us to note, that this is the First Amendment, and as Yash rightly pointed out, the reasonability of the restriction, the question of reasonability came in only because of the First Amendment. And just one final anecdote before we can move on. So in fact, when the First Amendment was being internally discussed within the Congress party, the word reasonable did not even find its mention in the initial discussion. It was only certain cabinet colleagues of Pandit Nehru who actually convinced him that, look, if we are putting in more grounds of restriction like public order and security of the state, it is important that we use the word reasonable, because only then the power of judicial review can come into play. Now, if you say absolute restriction, then any restriction is fine. If you give the government absolute power to restrict my freedom of speech, then how can the court review that? Only when you add the term reasonable can there be judicial review of something, right? In the strict sense, because Article 19.2, when we say a restriction is challenged on the ground that it violates 19.1a, we say it is an unreasonable restriction. So the question of reasonability was in fact an afterthought, and that came in only subsequently when the bill was being debated and discussed. So this entire question of security of the state and public order is what has given subsequent governments after 1951 the power to actually restrict our freedom of speech.
Thank you so much for that insight, Varun. With that, I would like to ask you one more question, which is in coming back to the present times. Our Honorable Justice D.Y. Chandrachud recently spoke about the police giving statements before a case was solved, and he made certain statements in light of that. Taking this into consideration, and also seeing how the Mumbai police is dealing with the entire TRP scandal, what are your opinions on the scope of authority that the prosecuting agencies have in this particular case?
So I think it's a very interesting question because we've seen this over the last few months after the unfortunate death of Sushant Singh Rajput, that it's become a complete media circus that we witness on a daily basis on television. So I think unfortunately this has become a question of some sort of political rivalry between majorly one or two news channels versus the Mumbai police. And this has become a completely ugly mess, which is very unfortunate because in this mess, what we don't realize is that the rights of people are in fact violated. So the kind of witch hunt that the NCB did, it actually violates the fundamental rights of life and personal liberty of a lot of people involved, especially Riya Chakravarti. So if you take this into account, just to give a bit of context before I come and address your question, the prosecuting agency does have a very, very important role. And the prosecuting agency also has to have a bit of a thick skin. Now, if you're a prosecuting agency, you're a public servant after all. The Mumbai police consists of public officers. And you have to have a bit of a thick skin. You cannot simply react to everything and anything that the media is saying, because ultimately the media also has its own vested interests and it is trying to build a narrative. Now, it's up to you to insulate yourself from the narrative, and because your job ultimately is to do a fair and impartial investigation. Once you stick to that job of doing a fair and impartial investigation, then there will be no question of anyone trying to buy what the media is saying. Now, unfortunately, this has become a very untidy mess, so it's a bit difficult to comment exactly. But as far as the question is concerned regarding the role that the prosecuting agency has, now, yes, evidence cannot be leaked to the public domain, because when last month and even 2 months prior to that, we've been seeing this situation of WhatsApp chats being made public on a very regular basis. Almost on a daily basis, there was this one news channel, especially Times Now, which was to make WhatsApp communication public on a daily basis. Now, that's a very clear and a very textbook violation of the right to privacy, which is also part of Article 21. So when these things happen, and the leaks, now where are the leaks coming from? The leaks are coming from the investigating agencies, because otherwise no one else will hand it voluntarily to the media. The media claims it has great sources, but we all know they don't. So because of that, it's very important to keep in mind that if the investigating agencies are not willing to safeguard human rights, that is the first big flaw that they are making, because ultimately our criminal justice system is based on the fact that human rights have to be adhered to. We are not a police state. So even when we talk about our criminal justice system and the powers of the prosecuting agencies, Article 21 has a very important role to play along with Article 19, because what a prosecuting agency does, it cannot be an unreasonable deprivation of my life, liberty, and my freedoms, etc. This is something which is very important for us to know, that even when you talk about a police commissioner giving statements in the media, what we forget is that because of the statements, a certain view is made, a certain kind of assumption is made that so-and-so is going to be the outcome of a case. And that in fact affects the rights of those who we may not see on television, but their rights are affected on a daily basis. Now, I'll just give you one example. So because of everything that happened, the person who suffered probably the most was Riya Chakravarti. I'm not against, in favor of her or against her or anything. What I'm saying is, when someone is facing a trial, they're innocent until proven guilty. Now, you cannot subject that kind of a person to a witch hunt or the kind of mental trauma that she was subjected to. The media is following her, they're running behind her car, etc. But that's not the kind of society we want to live in. That's not the values that we cherish, like the values of our constitution which we cherish. We cannot hound someone just because we have to satisfy our TRP interests. And an important role to play in this regard is of the prosecuting agency, because it's up to them to ensure that the trial is fair and impartial. If they don't do it, then it's only then will we have these TV channels, etc., who are trying to take the law into their own hands. If the prosecuting agency is firm, there will be no question of this kind of vendetta happening. And when we talk about vendetta, we have to also remember that the prosecution cannot have vendetta. Now, to a certain extent, this entire TRP battle that Yash spoke about, it's also a question of vendetta, because there is our news channels and then there's the Mumbai police who are trying to get into each other's throats. But that is what is problematic, because the rights of a lot of others are sacrificed in this kind of a battle that we see on a daily basis.
Right. So since we are talking about the TRP manipulation scandal, considering the system of measuring TRP depends on the viewership of the channel and not exactly on the content of the channel, do you think that the current system is flawed as it encourages channels to become more flashy or controversial, as you also somehow pointed? But still, also
Yeah.
in light of this, are there any legal obligations that the stakeholders such as NBFC or NBA or even the media houses have towards the society with respect to say?
Correct. Yeah, that's a good question. So firstly, yeah, I think you're absolutely right when you say that this entire question of TRP becomes an incentive to build narratives which may suit the media. For example, most of the debates that we see on television right now, they don't present both sides of the spectrum accurately. Now, as a viewer, what I want is both sides of the spectrum so that I can make my own judgment. I don't want someone trying to bang something in my head that, oh no, this is the right view to take. That's the first problem. And the second problem is that all reporting nowadays has become about building narratives. It's not about portraying facts in the accurate manner. And people are taking extreme liberties with the facts whenever they're reporting something. Now, that's the biggest problem. If you start taking liberty with the facts, if you're not honest with those who are watching you, that's when the problem begins. And why are people dishonest? Why are narratives created? Why is propaganda spread through TV media especially? That's only because of TRP. Because only when you claim TRP can you actually build on your business, etc. In the media industry, in the TV media industry especially. And also there was this allegation recently that channels such as Republic TV are trying to buy people to view their channel and increase their TRP. They're actually giving money to people so that they can view their channel. Now these kind of things happen only because this entire TRP race is ultimately a race to the bottom. It doesn't benefit anyone. No one is better off because of this kind of TRP. And no channel comes across as neutral or impartial for people like you and me who actually want to consume fact-based news, because we are all capable of making our own judgment. And we know that it's very important as law students and lawyers to form an independent opinion which is not based on what someone else is saying. So people of our age understand these things. So what they want is facts so that they can build their opinion on the basis of those facts. They don't want creation of narrative and propaganda, because that is what affects their thinking, and that's what affects them to actually take lopsided views on issues. And yeah, so there needs to be a relook into this entire TRP system. And probably we eventually need to move away from this entire concept of having TRPs. Because ultimately, see, even TV media, something that you watch on a voluntary basis. And there should just be free competition. If my show is better than your show, then you'll obviously come and watch my show. For example, if India Today and Republic TV are doing two shows, and India TV show is more objective and involves expert views, etc., I will obviously go there. But I will not go there if their only thing is berating another channel or trying to put someone else down, because that's not what I'm interested in. And that's not what people, the youth of our generation, are interested in, because everyone wants to form opinions based on facts. That's something which is very important. And yeah, when you talk about the responsibility of the media, so to a great extent, the print and the digital media, because nowadays you have some very good digital media websites, etc. Both of them are doing their job to a great extent, because they're actually bringing to us fact-based reporting, investigative journalism, etc. The problem to a great extent is in the television media, because that's when this entire bogey of TRP comes in. And that's when narratives and propaganda is created. So this is something which we need to note. Like the TV media is, in fact, can be the most influential, because a lot more people watch TV than people who actually sit and open a laptop and open digital websites and read news. So this is something which we need to know. And in this era of YouTube, everything goes viral very, very soon. So that's something which we need to know, that a single video can lead to a lot of propaganda and the creation of a lot of false narratives. So this is something which is very important for us to keep in mind. And when we talk about responsibility, there was this recent controversy when Sudarshan News, which is a Hindi news channel, wanted to air this show called UPSC Jihad. Now, when you do these kind of things, when you try to create UPSC Jihad, which is basically to say that Muslims are infiltrating the civil service. Now, when you try to create narratives of this kind and your facts are not accurate and you're only trying to target one particular community, that's when you spread hatred in society. And the media is the first tool that anyone would use in order to create propaganda and narratives. So the media has a very high responsibility. And this responsibility, obviously, I think your next question would be regarding regulation. So there has to be some form of regulation, but what is the manner in which they should be regulated is again a very debatable point, because what we also need to keep in mind is that you don't want to give the state more power than what it already has, because the state has tremendous power to control our freedom of speech and expression anyway. And there are a lot of laws which work in favor of the state. So when we talk about responsibility of the media, one manner in which they can regulate is self-regulation, which is what they try to do. But we all know that self-regulation will have pitfalls, because everyone will not comply with their internal code that they have. And if you have some journalists who only want to create propaganda, they're never going to comply with certain rules and regulations which the industry has prescribed. So I think one issue which needs larger debate in society is how to regulate television media, because by and large, I feel that the digital media and the print media, the newspapers, etc., are doing a good job, like in terms of giving fact-based reporting and investigative journalism. They're not trying to build too many narratives around a certain viewpoint. So there's something which we need to know, the distinction between television on the one hand and other forms of media on the other hand.
Right. So like this brings us to our last question, maybe a conclusive question and the way forward, as you already mentioned regarding the regulation. But I would like you to go back to recently when there was a petition in the Kerala High Court in the month of August, I believe. And the petition was with respect to have a proper regulation of electronic media as we have for print media, as you mentioned, like we have Press Council of India or something as such. However, the state of Kerala, the High Court of State of Kerala, opined that rejected at the first place. They rejected the petition, and they opined that a citizen will enjoy both the freedoms given under Article 19 Clause 1 and 21 without inter se with the rights guaranteed in the provision. Now, however, if we go last week to the Bombay High Court, in a judgment which was with respect to a media trial judgment, the Bombay High Court asked the Solicitor General, the Assistant Solicitor General, that why does not the center has a statutory mechanism for content generated on electronic media similar to the Press Council of India. Now, how do you analyze these remarks of both the Honorable High Courts, keeping in mind that we also need to maintain the freedom of speech and freedom of press?
Exactly. So I'll just draw on from my answer to the previous question. So when we talk about regulation, now regulation invariably ends up giving more power to the state to actually curb freedom of speech and expression. And the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting already has powers to put in some curbs on TV channels, etc. In fact, in the month of February and March, when the Delhi riots were taking place, 2 Malayalam news channels were in fact banned for a period of 24 hours by the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. So when we talk about TV media, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry does have some powers. Now, electronic media is, again, governments don't like it because many times it's the electronic media which is more honest than the print, etc., than the newspapers, etc., because they're more forthright in their opinions and their views. And they clearly take sides on certain issues. When it comes to very contentious issues, they've taken a fact-based approach as well, but they also take strong legal and factual positions on a lot of issues. So yeah, I would personally say that the electronic media need not be subject to any strict regulation. Obviously, if you violate any other provision of law, then you can be prosecuted, etc. And in India, we also have a very strong civil defamation framework as well as a criminal defamation framework. And by the way, our section 499 and 500 of the IPC, which deal with criminal defamation, are still part of our statute book. So even that can be resorted to. So already we have given the state a tremendous set of powers through other legal means, etc. And we also have a very infamous section 124A, which is sedition. So we also have these kind of provisions which are unfortunately applied on a regular basis, even against journalists who work in the electronic media. So already electronic media faces a lot of constraints. So I would, in my personal opinion, there should not be any additional need for regulation, etc., for the electronic media specifically, because that would only give the state more power to curb information that they do not like. For example, if a particular media house takes a policy position against some particular initiative of the government, then the government will have more incentive to try and impose curbs on them. And that will happen only if the government's powers of regulation are increased even more. So when you talk about regulation, it in a way ends up giving the government more power to regulate what we see and what we don't see, which is something that we should hesitate, because no government is in power permanently. If we like the government that is in power today, tomorrow a government in power which we don't like will come. So as people said in the 1950s itself, when the First Amendment was being discussed, as parliamentarians said, you should not frame laws that give excessive power to future generations. And we saw what this power can do when you had the emergency from 1975 to 1977. And as I pointed out earlier, in the emergency, the first curbing of information happened when the print media was silenced. So we do not want to enter into any sort of dangerous territory by giving the state more control over what information we see and what information we don't see. Because as of today, even as the private parties play a very important role in determining what content we see and what content we don't see. Because as we know, Facebook has in fact influenced elections in the United States of America and other African countries as well. So private corporations, which social media companies, which are private corporations, play a very important role in determining what we see and what we don't see. And when you have these private corporations which can actually censor content in an arbitrary fashion without much legal remedy for the person whose content has been censored, we don't want a state to simultaneously come in and exert more power on those people who cannot speak for themselves. For example, it's different when politicians, etc., come into the picture. But when we talk about journalists, law students, academics, intellectuals, they have very little support from the system to back them up in case there's a particular charge or a particular case against them. For example, if someone is accused, an academic like Anand Teltumbde, etc., is sent to jail on charges of sedition under UAP, etc., then for him, it's much more difficult to get out when compared to a politician, etc., who has much more financial resources and all. So I think we need to be very careful when we talk about regulation of the media, because we need to note that even as of today, we have British era laws like Section 124A, Section 153A, which in a way the state can use. And the state has misused these laws on a regular basis to censor content and to arrest people, so that they get a warning that this kind of content should not be portrayed against the government on a second occasion. So it's very important for us to note that when the state already has so many different provisions of law that they can apply, we should be very wary of giving the state more power to control our lives. And just one last thing to conclude. So when we talk about the emergency, because in the emergency was when we had free speech controlled to the maximum extent possible. Now in the emergency, there was a formal declaration of emergency at least. And at that point of time. Now today, what some scholars say is that we have an undeclared emergency, because a lot of restriction on the rights of the press are happening without there being a formal declaration of emergency, but the practical effect is the same. And even Yash pointed this out when he began his introduction, that the practical effect that we have today is that there is censorship to a very great extent. And we many times don't know how the censorship is being imposed, because every single instance where a particular person's liberty is violated is not even reported in the public sphere. So there are a lot of cases which go untouched, and a lot of instances which we don't even read about on a daily basis. So it's very important for us to remember that we should safeguard our rights with the utmost level of sanctity. And our safeguarding our rights is not based on our ideology. Like, for example, the right to freedom of speech and expression should be separate from our ideological viewpoint. Because, and as they say, like, I don't defend what you say, but I will defend your right to say it. So this is something which is very important for us to know, that I may not like you, but I'll defend your right to give a different opinion and a different perspective to an issue. So I think, yeah, this is like from my end, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Varun, for making it here today and actually giving us a proper insight as to what freedom of speech and expression is in the most practical sense possible. So you brought out a lot of points, and I would like to actually believe that I would introspect on these points when I go back, that we as people are involving in in our own policing, and censorship goes way beyond just laws and all the provisions made within the law or the constitution or societal norms. It is us who within ourselves actually regulate ourselves and ensure that we do not do something or we do something.
Exactly. Yeah.
So in light of that, it changes the entire perspective as to what media is, and it becomes more, and the aspect of what self-regulation is in present times brings me to the point that we can safely say that it is up to us to see what we want to see and take what we want to take from the entire media setup that exists today. Because it would be very difficult to actually ensure that, see the whole system changes. Rather, it is up to us to be vigilant and smart enough to take what we want to take, and see what is actually real and what is not actually real. So with that, Varun, I would thank you so much for coming here today and giving us your time as well as valuable inputs on the same. I hope you have a great day, and I hope all our viewers have a great day as well.
And yeah, I
Thank
hope everyone enjoys watching this, and congrats on your initiative. I think it's a very good initiative. The fact that
Thank
law
you.
students are coming up with their own channels is fantastic.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.